Hello, what is up, people that might be watching this video? So I attempted the Demon Turf Tower on stream and decided I want to do it off stream because it's like less pressure to be entertaining for long periods of time. Plus, I can like edit footage as I want. I'm probably thinking to just show off like clips of fresh reactions to new floors or maybe funny moments, I don't know. Or I might even just show the final run that made it, but I'm leaning towards editing it so you see my fresh reactions to floors I haven't been to. For those who don't know, the highest floor I made it on stream was floor 20. I haven't beaten floor 20, so I'm trying to remove that hex, the glide hex right now. Also, I'll be listening to our therapist recommended podcast. So you might hear like bits and pieces of info about DID, possible trigger warnings for like trauma and stuff. I don't think it gets too triggering, but just heads up for that. um I might also listen to some my headmate Skitter's playlist at some point, so who knows, there's recordings might be all over the place with what audio you're hearing. Just to let you know. Okay, that's all I gotta say. I guess, I mean, my mic is on like during this recording, so I might say things at times, but I think mostly I'm not gonna say much because I'm just chilling. Okay, here I go.
Hello, this is Dr. E. I need to introduce the following podcast a bit. I did another interview and I appreciate our guests spending time with us, but there's several things that you need to know before you listen. The first is that he was outside during the interview, and so you will hear some birds and some other outdoor sounds that are in no way at all meant to be triggering to anyone, but do be aware that you hear a bird, one particularly friendly one, throughout the interview. The second is that by the nature of this interview and who our guest is, there are several triggering topics included in the interview. Further, as part of the discussion, he does include several specific case studies that are both public and well known and very detailed in their graphic report. Because of this, there are different types of abuse mentioned, there are weapons mentioned, there are different types of confinement mentioned. Further, there are types of organizational and other ritual abuse scenarios and examples given, including abuse in church settings, satanic ritual abuse, and other examples of organizational abuse. In addition, further discussion about abuse that is ongoing into adulthood is also discussed. As always, please make sure that your system is safe before listening to the podcast and grounded after listening to the podcast. Thank you for taking good care of yourself and being attentive to your own needs as you listen and after listening. Thank you. Hello, this is Dr. E, and today I'm interviewing Professor Warwick Middleton. Professor Middleton has had substantive ongoing involvement with research, writing, teaching, including workshops and seminar presentations, supervision, and conference convening. He has made substantial and ongoing contributions to the bereavement and trauma literatures and was with Dr. Jeremy Butler, author of the first published series in the Australian scientific literature detailing the abuse histories and clinical phenomenology of patients fulfilling diagnostic criteria for dissociative identity disorder. He was the first researcher to publish systematic research into ongoing incestuous abuse during adulthood. He is a fellow and past president of the ISSTD, is a co-chair of the ISSTD Membership Committee, and vice chair of the ISSTD Scientific Committee. Professor Middleton chairs the Cannon Institute. In 1996, he was a principal architect in establishing Australia's first dedicated unit treating dissociative disorders, the Trauma and Dissociation Unit in Belmont Hospital. He has authored many papers and book chapters and has been the co-editor of 2 books based on journal special issues. He holds professorial appointments at the University of Queensland, La Trobe University, the University of New England, and the University of Canterbury. Welcome, Dr. Middleton. I know that you were studying originally bereavement and getting your doctorate, and through those cases, first were introduced to trauma. Can you tell me how you got involved with treating trauma patients after that?
What I was seeing with severely abused patients is a spectrum of the broader trauma area, and one becomes aware that in order to survive and in order for dissociation to work, one has to somewhat dissociate the fact that one dissociates. And dissociation is a disruption in the normally integrated processes of identity, consciousness, memory, motor control, and emotional response. It's a way of shutting off channels of recording, and in a way that protects a traumatized child in the longer term from having to deal with something that they're incapable of dealing with. And that usually involves ongoing abuse by someone who is also their primary attachment object and caregiver. So there's this inbuilt contradiction that the person who most likely is your abuser is also the person to whom you rely for attachment and protection. So it's nothing very unusual about the process of dissociation. It's actually makes a whole lot of psychological sense to realise that, of course, in somebody who doesn't have a developed sense of identity when their trauma starts, that identity is going to be part of the dissociative process. And where trauma starts early, before there is stable identity, then the compartmentalisation of trauma, which say in an adult is a compartment between a traumatised and a non-traumatised part, in a child takes on the persona of different identity states, some of whom are daddy's special little girl and some of whom know the extent of the abuse and only surface at times of the abuse, and so compartmentalise memories of trauma. I early on decided that the most productive way in which to further the establishment of the field in Australia was to do a detailed phenomenological study of a representative and substantial number of individuals who satisfied diagnostic criteria for DID. And over a period of 5 years, I and a colleague, Jeremy Butler, collected fine-grained data on the phenomenology and abuse histories of 62 individuals seen in Brisbane, selected for no other reason than that I had legitimate clinical contact, or he had legitimate clinical contact with these individuals. Of the series, I had contact with 57 and he had contact with 5 such individuals. And the core findings of that study, which was published in 1998, so we're getting back over 2 decades now, was that the abuse history and phenomenology of individuals who satisfied diagnostic criteria for DID in Brisbane, Australia, was pretty well identical to the phenomenology and abuse histories of individuals in series who had been described in North America. So going forward, the next step was to establish an inpatient unit that attempted to address the particular issues of individuals with dissociative disorders, and that was how I became involved in being the principal architect of the establishment of the Trauma and Dissociation Unit at Belmont Hospital. And we celebrated with a conference in Brisbane back in 2017, the 20th anniversary of the establishment of that unit. Over time, and it was apparent in the first published series, I became focused on the issue in my research and writing on those particular individuals with DID, and they all have DID, who have been subjected to ongoing incestuous abuse during adulthood. If one looked at the literature of even recent years, one could be forgiven for thinking that apart from the odd case study and anecdotal references, that there was no systematic research whatsoever on the fate of a significant proportion of individuals with DID for whom the abuse essentially never ended. And one of the paradoxes of researching this field, where one has to show due care and never go beyond the verifiable data, that the individuals in this spectrum are people who very much resemble the large group now of individuals who have been the subject of articles in the popular press about that same phenomena. And I probably, somewhat paradoxically, have Joseph Fritzl to thank for stimulating press interest in the phenomena. So, as you're aware, Joseph Fritzl had sexually abused his daughter Elizabeth for 31 years, and for 24 of that he had her imprisoned in a homemade dungeon under his residence in Austria. And apart from the fact that he actually created a dungeon, the core elements of his abuse was very similar to multiple other reported cases. And in 2013, I reported in the international literature an analysis of 51 such individuals or groups of individuals reported in the world press who had subjected children, usually daughters, to this sort of ongoing abuse. Obviously, press reports tend to be somewhat sensationalised and usually fairly short, so we don't get the fine-grained collection of data that one sees in a systematic scientific series. But what it did, it allowed me to actually identify from unequivocal cases that were verified by court reports and police statements a phenomena that one could then examine more closely in a series of clinical cases, which I published again later that year, which was a series of 10 such individuals seen in Brisbane who had essentially identical abuse histories to the sorts of people that were the subject of verified court reports. And if one looks way back to the published series in 1998 that I was involved in putting together, it was apparent back then that at least 1 in 8 patients with DID had this sort of history. They were victims of abuse that never ended. There used to be this assumption, of course, that somehow, bad as incest was, that it tended to end with, at least, if not before puberty, at least with puberty, where abusers and fathers, etc., became worried about pregnancy, and individuals became older and stronger and managed to leave the family environment, or something happened that brought the abuse to an end. But it's very apparent that for a significant proportion, and I would say now, having seen many more such cases, that the 1 in 8 figure of people with DID who have this sort of background is, if anything, a tad on the conservative side. So if you if you look at published figures for the population incidence of DID in the adult population, with the median of published series is somewhere in the order of 1.1%. And if one was to assume, and congruent with my published research, that something in the order of 1 in 8 of these were subjected to ongoing incest during adulthood, we actually end up with the challenging figure that about 1 in 700 of the adult population have this sort of background where the abuse is ongoing. And of course, among the groups that I have seen, one sees examples where the abuse has literally, by one or other family members and associated organised abusers, where sexual abuse has continued for half a century. And that was also borne out in the published press reports where there were press reports documenting cases where ongoing incest had occurred for over 40 years. And of course, when it was originally published, Joseph Fritzl's case led people to wonder whether there was something unusual about Austria. Than we had Adolf Hitler coming from Austria, we had Joseph Fritzl coming from Austria, and of course there were a couple of other high-profile cases of severe abuse associated with Austria. And of course, very shortly it became very apparent that every country where there's a reasonable court system, that we have similar such cases. And soon there were British Fritzls and Scottish Fritzls and American Fritzls and Australian Fritzls and so on and so forth. In 2012, I published an updated series of such cases, and as time's gone on, one just sees such cases in the popular literature continue to accumulate. And while some become the subject of books, and where there is more detailed description of their dissociation, the brief press reports usually don't have an opportunity to delve into any of the complexities of their dissociative conditions. One of the things that I've found is that every single person that I've ever seen who has this sort of history has DID. It's almost like if you're going to survive and you haven't suicided, you need to be severely dissociative in order to live with and somehow survive that sort of ongoing abuse.
What is the difference in the dynamic between the abuser and the child and the abuser and the adolescent, or the abuser and the adult?
When one looks at abuse that continues into adulthood, one has usually a strong attachment, despite the fact that at one level some parts of an individual are very aware that they're being abused, but they're also as we as a species, mammalian species, strongly attached to our primary attachment figures. And if the only attachment figures are abusers, then there is a deep ambivalence about acting definitively against someone who is both your strongest attachment figure and also your principal abuser. So disentangling oneself from that sort of abuse scenario, yes, it happens, and therapy is an very important component of that. But one actually does see individuals who they never reach escape velocity. Yes, they're deeply traumatized by it and deeply shamed, and the principal mechanisms by which abusers keep their victims in this sort of role is via use of shame, fear, and conditioning. Shame is that that the child victim really wanted this, or wanted it, or elicited it, that they're really a slut, or combined with no one will believe you, and if you tell anyone, I will kill you, or you will go to hell, and all mixed in at times with you're my special person and I love you and you're my little princess, And what became apparent when getting that form of extreme abuse, that in the series of people that I've seen, that it's very apparent that one or both of the parents, seemingly from what the victim could pick up, had themselves had been quite traumatized. And in the published series that I mentioned of 10, at least half felt that their father or stepfather had dissociative identity disorder themselves, and most were aware that their father had come from an abusive background. And with mothers, we saw not dissimilar pattern where they also had an abuse history and a tendency to be dissociative themselves. So when you're surrounded by, generations of people who are traumatized and dissociative, and where the abusive culture is so ingrained, it becomes a very challenging thing. There was a case that came to light in New South Wales just in the last half decade or so, and that was a family known as the Cult family, where literally there were documented 4 generations of this extended family where every generation was abused. And when the authorities finally sort of moved on a sort of a rural conclave at Cootamundra in the bush, they found 10 children, and of the 10, these are young children that needed to be put in care. Of the 10, nine had parents who were related to each other. So there were 9 of the 10 were incestuously fathered children, and they were the 4th generation of a family where the incestors went back and back and back. Now, one has to be extremely careful in making generalizations, lest one assume that every person who's been traumatized is automatically an abuser. But it does point to a reality that when you're dealing with the extreme end of the spectrum, that abusers tend to coerce or force their abused offspring to also abuse their own offspring, and that it brings with it, strong feelings of shame and a strong tendency to maintain silence. So even though you get egregious, abusers, yes, some will sort of finally take out some sort of aggravated violence order to keep their abuser away. But it's actually very rare that they will initiate, court proceedings that would have their father jailed. A rare exception was one in northern New South Wales, whose court matter became prominent a couple of years ago, where a father and a mother were both jailed, and where 2 sisters gave evidence of severe sadistic abuse. And that's when you're dealing with this spectrum, sadism, the use of weapons, knives, guns, death threats are commonplace. And one looks into the families, one sees, and these are verified examples where, the close family members and close associates seem to die by unnatural means, homicide, suicide at sort of alarming rates. And while I said before that we're looking at rough figures, that are where the DID incorporates ongoing incest during adulthood of 1 in 700, that could be an underestimate of the number affected, because when one looks at the group that have survived, most of them have survived serious suicide attempts. Most of them have been seriously physically assaulted and carry scars and internal injuries from those sort of assaults. And a number of them have had inducements to suicide by their abusers. So it's very apparent that quite a number of people in that spectrum are already dead, so they never get included in the figure. And of course that keeps the issue hidden, that these people die by suicide or other natural causes or misadventure, and no one is able to look at the overall picture and actually demonstrate all of the causal links. The fact that society has large numbers of people who are in positions of authority and who abuse children or who use their institution to cover up such abuse was really brought into graphic relief by the Australian Royal Commission into the institutional responses to child sexual abuse, which concluded late in 2017 and which was the most comprehensive national inquiry into such abuse in human history. And yet, even then, that inquiry focused on institutions, particularly churches, and of the churches that were represented among those victims most frequently was the Catholic Church, where of all of the victims of institutional abuse that gave evidence at the Australian Royal Commission, no less than 40% of them were victims of clergy abuse or other church officials within the Catholic Church. No faith group really remained unaffected. And I might also add that when one looks at professional groups, one finds examples of prominent abusers who outwardly appear eminently respectable and persuasive and powerful, who nevertheless have abused people who are vulnerable, including those who are children, and that includes people in the mental health professions, people in sporting professions, people who are in the scouting movement, who run orphanages, etc. The salutary message of recent years is that that abusers don't usually declare themselves, and they use positions of authority to cover their tracks or to intimidate their victims or to organise access to victims. And I guess one of the features of recent years as we have become a digitally interconnected community is that we're just seeing graphic examples of the way child abusers organise via the encrypted sites on the internet to swap at times live video feeds of children being abused. And we've seen multiple large, encrypted rings of child abusers being uncovered in various law enforcement probes, one in which was the probe by the FBI into Playpen, which came to light in 2015. And Playpen was a site that allowed for the connection between child sex abusers online, and the number of members of that site when it was published was in the order of 215,000 members. So the one is abuse, and there are numerous examples of people from prominent professions right across from politicians through to university professors to members of the FBI, Justice Department, police, child protection agency workers, etc., etc. That the message is that within all of those groups we find prominent examples of people who have been using their position to have access or cover for the abuse of children. So one becomes, I guess, appropriately cautious about just taking things on face value. And I guess the prime example of this would be the ongoing series of abuse scandals involving the Catholic Church, where country by country we have seen dramatic and evolving evidence of the extent of abuse in prominent archdioceses that stretch back for 50 or more years in entire countries, where it becomes apparent that the senior hierarchy of the church have covered up for pedophile abusers and moved them around from diocese to diocese, and where there has been destruction of evidence. And it's sort of got to the point where we're seeing now that fairly frequently in the process, it's not like the old days where there is some polite inquiry into the church. These days, law enforcement arrive with search warrants and take away documents from from the administration of prominent bishops. And when we look at places like the Netherlands, we find that, the majority of the bishops in the entire country have credibly involved in the cover-up or knowledge of child sexual abuse that was not reported. And we've seen these prominent examples in Holland, Germany, Ireland, the US, Australia, etc., where we get the predictable, expressions of regret and need for more openness. And we're now arrived for the first time in human history, really, where the Catholic Church, in terms of the number of its senior members who have been charged or facing trial or have been convicted of serious crimes, is unprecedented. And where, a person who's, was third in line in the power succession of the Pope, has been committed to trial. And there's a prominent bishop in France, I should say cardinal in France. There's a Cardinal McCarrick in the US, whose issues have prompted, a senior bishop to call on the Pope to repent and to resign. We just never seen that sort of public attention to our institutions in the history of humanity, really. I mean, the Church has been around 2,000 years, and yes, we've been through the Reformation 500 years ago, but this is actually, if anything, more dramatic in terms of, of the way in which we run our institutions. And I might add, within psychiatry, we have seen much more of a trend to put any allegations about sexual boundary violations or abuse prominently within the hands of police rather than, or registration authorities, rather than attempting any sort of in-house inquiry. They've proven to be demonstrably unhelpful and usually embarrassing in terms of their results. So that's an overview of some of the issues.
How do we help people if it's so pervasive and so extensive?
Well, I guess there are two major prongs to that. One is society itself, benefits from being encouraged to be open, the bravery of individuals who are able to finally tell their truth needs to be acknowledged and supported. And at the same time, we need to be aware that this sort of abuse has massive impacts on the causation of mental illness and social problems such as, alcoholism, drug abuse, sexually transmitted disease, not to mention smoking, heart disease, etc. In fact, the more traumatized one is, the more types of trauma one has growing up, the more likely one is to develop mental illness or physical illness, to have a teenage pregnancy, or to develop lung disease from smoking, or cardiovascular disease from alcohol and drugs, etc. So none of these things, there's not just a unilateral sort of unidirectional result from abuse. It filters through, and from generation to generation, as I sort of mentioned, it can continue to impact. At the individual level, obviously, we need to be aware, and health professionals need to be aware of trauma spectrum disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative identity disorder, somatization disorder, so-called borderline personality disorder, etc. In fact, when we look at, all of the literature that's looked at the abuse histories of people who present to mental health centres or mental health outpatient departments, we find that approximately 2/3 come with significant history of childhood physical and or sexual abuse. And when we add in abuse and neglect, emotional abuse and neglect, I should say, the figure comes up to around 80%. Now, that's not to say that everybody that presents in any way to a mental health facility has a condition caused by abuse, but nevertheless, it's undeniable that the more abuse one has, the more likely it is that one's going to end up with major mental health issues and major physical issues. Yes, there are other factors that cause mental illness, and just as there are other factors that cause physical illness. One thing you asked about, what do we do? I think there was something very valuable about the Australian Royal Commission. And as one is aware, there've been a number of Royal Commissions or similar commissions, national commissions, launched in various parts of the world, and none of them have done it anything like as well as the Australian Royal Commission. I see the British Commission, into historical child abuse is largely been a lengthy and messy process that has yet to get any real traction, and where they've been through multiple different commissioners. The Australian Commission started with the Run Royal Commissioner and assistant commissioners and went through the entire 5-year process with the same team intact, and very early on they made a central, anchor point of their commission's work was respect for the dignity of abuse survivors. Survivors didn't give evidence in a way where they were put on trial or where they were cross-examined. They were supported in large numbers in a very empathic and sympathetic environment to be able to tell their story to someone in authority. And yes, there were public hearings which looked in depth at a range of institutions and which gave findings that could be generalised to multiple institutions. So there was an in-depth look at say, certain schools or certain sporting bodies or certain church groups or certain church policies, etc. And that was balanced by a whole lot of individuals, over 8,000 in fact, who gave individual testimony about their own sexual abuse within institutional settings that involved both abuse and the cover-up of the abuse. Now, it became very apparent to the Royal Commissioners that a large proportion of those who gave evidence about being sexually abused by institutions or representatives of institutions were also abused by members of their family. And it's very apparent that 90% plus child sexual abuse that happens within society doesn't happen particularly within institutions, but within that other untouched organisation, if you want to put it that way, the family, where 90% of child sexual abuse occurs within family groupings. And when you get to the extreme end of DID, one finds almost universally, as I found in my published studies, is that when you get ongoing incest into adulthood, almost invariably the abuse within the family extends to incorporate some form of organised abuse, whether it be associated with a church, whether it be a father's workmates, whether it be multi-generational family in orientation, or whether it be some form of a cult. There seems to be a natural human tendency to organise, whether one collects stamps, rides motorcycles, or abuses children. And we see that, hence, when we have an internet-connected society, we just see graphic evidence of organisational abuse on scales hitherto unimaginable.
Organizational abuse, even using that term, broadens the scope of different kinds of ritual abuse to include those other examples that you gave.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the term ritual abuse. I guess in the Prime Minister's public apology and his speech that came with it, our Prime Minister of the time last year, Scott Morrison, made reference to ritual occurring within abuse, and undoubtedly ritual is incorporated in some childhood sexual and other abuse, and the sorts of rituals that one encounters. One sees examples of things that involve religious symbols. It's I guess you get occasions where other symbols like satanic symbols, in a verified way, have been incorporated into significant crimes. That is not to say that as yet that there is significant hard evidence of some sort of multi-generational satanic worldwide organisation that sort of murders babies and eats them, etc. But those sorts of stories have circulated and have been circulating in various forms, probably for hundreds of years, but sort of got to prominence again in the 80s. And hence, when I was researching ongoing incest during adulthood, I was very careful to not go beyond the data, and that before I published systematic research onto individuals within the spectrum that I had assessed in detail, I published verified accounts and analysis of such individuals who had been widely reported in the world press. So that made it that gave a solid foundation to then being able to say, yes, this form of severe abuse exists, it is widespread, and what one sees clinically is very consistent with what is reported in the popular press and which appears in court reports and police statements. That did not happen with allegations that appeared in the 1980s about alleged satanic ritual abuse, where there were accounts of sort of cannibalism and babies being murdered in large numbers and etc. That's not to say that at times that some disturbed individuals, and there are disturbed individuals who have, and it's verified, used some form of reference to satanic symbols, just as they have used Christian symbols incorporated into their abuse. And I have patients where who've been abused by priests, where the abuse, I guess, is fairly mainstream for this sort of spectrum, but where on occasions there are some elements of Christian ritual incorporated into the abuse. So one needs to keep an open mind, but one does not need one's brain to fall out. And from very early on in the modern dissociative disorders / complex trauma field, there have been many individuals who have cautioned about going beyond the verifiable data. We also need to not report things that do happen and which are provable and verifiable because we just choose not to look. I do find it interesting that it took so long for systematic research into ongoing incestuous abuse during adulthood to actually be published. Up until 2013, the only references to it in the literature was the odd anecdotal reference and the odd single case study, sometimes as a autobiographical or biographical book written by a journalist or with a journalist, and that was the extent of it.
What has changed that's made it more accessible or possible culturally or as a society to listen to these accounts or to confirm data and actually publish it so that it's available to more people? What has changed?
I think we've reached a tipping point. If you look at the last 100 odd years, at various times, a few individuals have tripped over and reported on the reasonably widespread nature of severe child abuse. In fact, it even goes back further than that. If one looks at some of the French pathologists who are seeing the results of severe child abuse in, French morgues, back in the mid 1800s. It was apparent that severe abuse occurs within society, and as we kind of know, Freud was the first person to actually publish an account of the etiology of what was called hysteria, being, child sexual abuse occurring at an early age and usually involving a close family member. And within a very short period of time from publicly proclaiming his theory about the etiology of hysteria, he was already, by September 1897, reworking his theory and denying it, so that by 1905 he had renounced his so-called seduction theory and replaced it with a theory of Oedipal fantasy and hysterical mendacity. So we've got back to sort of a scenario where women are fantasizers and children can't be relied upon to tell the truth, and that people within the spectrum of hysteria, or what would also encompass what became known as borderline personality disorder, were prone to make wild and extravagant claims and were not to be believed. And, the disempowering of women, or the projection of women as lacking power, being unclean, being down the totem order in religious observance and in power structures, was well ingrained. And yes, over subsequent years, here and there, a study by a single individual did shine briefly a little light, but it did not capture, it was never captured as a widespread phenomenon until the late 70s. Feminism reached something of a critical point that coincided with the issues of returning Vietnam veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. But even then, when incest became finally acknowledged as a widespread phenomena, there was a backlash. I might point out that when I started psychiatry in 1980, the most prominently used comprehensive textbook in psychiatry was the comprehensive textbook of Friedman, Kaplan and Sadok, and in a small section buried in the back of the book there was a page and a bit on incest, which quoted no study more recent than 1955 on the prevalence, and it came up with a result that on their quoted prevalence, that was something, incest was a vanishingly rare phenomena, where one woman in about 1 million was subjected to incest. And like within 6 years of that, published epidemiological studies indicated that child sexual abuse in some form was occurring in over a third of women, and that something like 16% of the female adult population came with a history of some form of childhood incest. And of that 16, something like 4.5% involved a father or stepfather. So, the order of magnitude from 1 in a million to 160,000 per million as victims of incest gives some indication of just the extent of the non-focus and the denial of society, even in relatively recent times. And, going back to that period, it was the period where I was just finished training in psychiatry, and if incest was vanishingly rare, you can imagine how rare DID was, which was a condition that's particularly associated with severe incest.
So do you think that trauma is being reported or disclosed more, and so you're saying that it's often a kind of a comorbidity kind of thing, or that it's being misdiagnosed as other things?
Well, I think it's being reported far more frequently now. That's what I was saying about the tipping point. While I said there was a backlash, and that was sort of backlash that encompassed, polarizations and and professional disputes about the validity of recovered memories. And as you know, in about 1992, an organisation formed, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, formed by Pamela and Peter Fried with Rolf Underwager and Halida Wakefield in Philadelphia. And it gained prominence by being a focal point for people accused of incestuously abusing children and who proclaimed that they were innocent. And I'm not saying that there weren't significant numbers who have been falsely accused, just as there are people falsely accused of all sorts of crimes. But it also became apparent that this organisation made a focus of essentially, encouraging people to sue therapists, to try and essentially outlaw therapy, and to attack the foundations of the diagnosis of DID by putting forward some entity which was never been scientifically defined in terms of any operational criteria, that of the false memory syndrome. But it gained a lot of national and international press at the time, and that organisation sort of continued but became much less prominent over the last half decade. They don't no longer publish a newsletter. They have a scientific advisory committee, but a large proportion of the people that are named on their website are actually now deceased. And in that intervening period, we've seen this massive change in the way in which institutions are now seen, those that should normally be the bastions of moral authority and putting forth as the highest priority the welfare of children, to find that in fact they've just horribly let down children decade after decade and have covered their tracks or tried to. And we've seen so many examples in so many countries that it's no longer credible to say, that the fantasizing about abuse is an alternative to the reality that, our mainstream churches and our family, so-called nuclear family, are major contributors to child sexual abuse and to the causation of complex trauma, including dissociative identity disorder and the whole range of trauma spectrum disorders. And that includes, as I said, things like drug and alcohol addiction and abuse, sexual difficulties and disorders, sleeping disorders, eating disorders, proneness to depressive disorders, etc.
You were one of the first researchers to really link the dissociative disorders to trauma and to research those trauma histories specifically, and that you have been so careful to stay within the confines of the data itself and research and approaching it that way, so that it did get more traction and got a greater reception so that more people could learn about this. But you've also really done a lot to advocate and empower survivors through the way that you present it. So, for example, I want to read, with your permission, a quote from a presentation I saw you give actually in 2011. And here's
Right.
what you said that I have never forgotten, and it just really blew my mind. But you said, far more is right with them than what's wrong with them, and what's wrong with them was not caused by them.
Yes, that's right.
It's a powerful statement. It's a heavy statement, and it's really very straightforward and very simple, and maybe even very obvious. But I think it's a point that's not often said out loud by researchers or by those who are discussing survivors as if they are not in the room. It was good. Just thank you for that. It was a powerful statement, and I've shared it frequently.
Yeah, my colleague, Professor Jennifer Fried, and I might add that Jennifer, just by way of orientation, is the daughter of Peter and Pamela Fried, Jennifer's gone on to a distinguished career as an academic psychologist and is for the long-term editor of the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation. Jennifer has, written a lot about institutional betrayal, and one of the points she makes about abusers is that the standard response from the abuser is to deny and loudly attack, and to switch the focus from the victim to the offender, so that they become the victim, and the victim is now portrayed as somebody who is attacking them, and they're the innocent victim of an attack. I probably don't have to labour the point, but when one looks at that as a strategy, one sees certain parallels within the political process in your country at the moment, where loud denial and loud attack sort of seem to dominate the airways on a daily basis.
I very much appreciate you talking to me today, and I want to honor your time, so I know our hour is almost up. Is there anything you want to add before we finish?
Absolutely. You very generously sort of attributed to me a role in the field, and it is true that I have been involved for many years in Australia in terms of the sort of things I mentioned before, in terms of publishing, setting up a model of treatment, in terms of contributing to and collaborating with a number of organisations, and in trying to put together foundational research that provided a reference point for the emerging field in Australia. But I would very much emphasise that the modern dissociative field had its formation in more senior colleagues in the US particularly, and within that grouping, and I won't try and list them all by name, but I should give prominent examples to those who very early on were prominent in doing systematic research and in publishing in this area, and they include Richard Pluft, who was the editor for a decade of the journal Dissociation, who's a past president of our society, and who has treated more people with DID than anyone in the history of the world. Frank Putnam and Colin Ross, both of whom published major textbooks on the diagnosis and treatment of what was then called multiple personality disorder in 1989, and a veritable large grouping of other colleagues who in those early years and subsequently contributed to the foundation of a field, and that field is actually a strong field, and it's growing healthily. I look forward to being in the US in March 2019 this year for the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation annual conference, which will be in Times Square, New York, and it's bringing researchers and presenters from all over the world. It's nice that I have so many colleagues within Australia who are part of that organisation, and my colleague Martin Dorrihy, who I've collaborated with more than anyone else, succeeded me as a president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and is a prominent presenter and has made a major focus of his research the issue of shame. And I could talk a lot more about shame, but it's a core component of why and how abusers have kept their victims silent.
I know a little bit of the shame from Patricia DeYoung's work. What is your perspective on shame?
It's one of those emotions that it's not something attached to what you do, but is what's done to you, and it's a bit like having indelible tar sort of embedded in your skin. and it's used very effectively by abusers who manipulate the natural, normal sexual responsiveness that everybody has and turns that into an instrument of projecting blame and shame onto the victim, which they know in turn, at the one level, ties the victim to them, and at another level makes it incredibly difficult for that person to break free of that dynamic and to speak forcefully. One of the people I think who speaks beautifully about shame is Marilyn Van Derber, who was the 1958 Miss America and who did recover memories of her incestuous abuse that had been inaccessible. And she was at the time obviously highly dissociative, and who has gone on to, a very effective career where she speaks a lot about confronting shame and being able to, shame is someone else's problem. Once you get to be able to talk about what happened to you, someone else has a difficulty with it. It's their problem. It's not your problem. You're talking about something that somebody did to you who really wanted to keep you silent. I did send a recording. That was just my take on the loss of innocence.
Well, thank you.
Okay, you take care, Emma.
Thank you.
Sweet dreams, little one, sweet dreams, in the softer night of mottled beams, a child at rest, or so it seems. The curtains rustle in the breeze, her hands are resting on her knees, her hands are resting on her knees. Breathe gently in the depths of night, it is long to wait for the morning light. A chill is settling in the air, no sound is heard upon the stair. Breezes shift and shadows fall, flickering movements on the wall. Melodies play within her head as she softly rests upon her bed. Gentle is the pillow, gentle the night, touched as it is by soft starlight. Midnight came and midnight went, the peaceful sleep of a night well spent. Sleep on, sleep on, sleep on, by the dawn it will all be gone. Shadows fall and shadows creep, they do not awaken a child asleep. Sleep, little one, a time for rest. The night cocoons a child well blessed. A subtle sound in the dead of night. Something moves, a glimmer of light. Someone steps upon the stair. In a minute they'll be there. Breathe gently in the depth of night. It is long to wait for the morning light. It is long to wait for the morning light. Sweet dreams, little one, sweet dreams, in the softer light of mottled beams. A child at rest, or so it seems. A child at rest, or so it seems.
Thank you for joining us with System Speak, a podcast about dissociative identity disorder. You can listen to the podcast on Spotify, Google Play, and iTunes, or follow along on our website, www.systemspeak.org. Thanks for listening. Hello, today we're talking with Jeff Clark, the author of the children's book, The Patchwork Quilt. Beautifully illustrated, this book explains the story of a quilt that gets torn up into pieces. And each of the pieces of the quilt have a new role to play, but ultimately learn to work together and become a patchwork quilt.
I'm going to the bathroom. Be right back.
It's a beautiful metaphor that explains dissociative identity disorder to outside kids and internal littles. Though I planned to interview Jeff, what I did not plan on was the beautiful love story that he would share regarding his relationship with his wife and their journey through their own discovery and understanding of his wife's diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. I did also speak to his wife. While I don't air that on the podcast, I did have her permission to share his version of her story. It's pretty special. Welcome, Jeff Clark.
Definitely. This is really a story about me and my wife and my family. You know, it's definitely a collective story. My wife and I have been together for about 23 years. We've been married, and we dated for about 6 years before that. So, you know, we were high school sweethearts.
That's so sweet.
It is. It was very much one of those fairy tale kind of romances where she actually was dating one of my friends. Yes, and I really liked her, but you know I had I always had said, no, she's with you. And well, when they broke up, um, we started going out shortly thereafter.
Wow.
And
what a story.
yeah, that's she had actually been sick for quite some time, and the school district in the area was homeschooling her. I guess that you'd call it homeschooling. They had a teacher that they would send out to kids that were homebound.
Yes.
And yes, and then the teacher would go around to them, and I had met her and just found her absolutely fabulously interesting, and I also thought, wow, this has got to be so boring, so sad, so lonely, not to have the interactions and be out with everyone else at school. So I actually started going.
You?
What's that?
You checked on her, didn't you?
Yes, I did. So I started going over to her house every day after school, and bringing a Scrabble board, and we would sit and play Scrabble.
Oh my goodness.
So that was, I guess you would say, our courting for a while. And then her health improved where she started being able to come in for some classes. And when we actually started to, I'm doing air quotes here, I know everyone can't see that, when we actually started to date, was the first time that I ever skipped school. She had told me that she needed to talk with me about something, and we went out and we talked, and she told me that she had been sexually abused.
Oh no.
And yeah, and so my first reaction was, have you talked with your parents? Have you talked with authorities? What are you doing? And she related that she knew something had happened with her biological father, but she didn't know what had happened.
Wow, she was already dissociating.
Yes. I didn't have those words, and at that point, I always took it, or in my mind was more of, this is something she doesn't want to talk about. This is something has happened, and it's just too much for her, and she's dealing with it in her own ways, and
so you understood it like she didn't want to talk about it because it was too hard, not yet realizing she literally couldn't talk about it because of the dissociation.
Correct. And that was, it was interesting because, as we were getting to know each other and talking, and, when you're forming those relationships, especially early, there's a lot of time we spent hours upon hours sitting out on her front porch talking. I was always surprised, as we would talk about things, I would bring up, things from pop culture or things from the past, things that, people our age really should have and know as like touchstone things.
Right.
And there were so many things that would come up that she would say, no, I don't remember that. No, and she would say, I don't remember my childhood. And again, I always took that to mean, I don't want to talk about my childhood. So she started to go to group therapy, and I was taking her, and I was actually taking her mom too. She was going to a group also because, there's all kinds of, issues that the rest of the family had to deal with.
Right.
So I was their chauffeur for, a good 2 years.
Wow.
And, after about, 12 months in, 24 months in, she started saying, I'm not really sure if this is helping. And then finally she said, this isn't doing anything for me anymore. It's stirring up, more negative within me than it is helping. I don't think I need to do this anymore.
Wow. And that's so common with people with dissociative disorders or trauma anyway, especially when they're not yet being treated for the trauma. because
Right.
like there's so many of us that have been through so many therapists or so many different programs trying to find the right help until someone knew what was going on.
Right. Right. So, at that point, she stopped going into therapy, and we were really kind of moving into another stage of our lives as we were going off to college, and she excelled in college. She had a 4.0. She was actually the valedictorian, and it
Wow.
seemed to be doing very, very well. We went to college at the same place, and after 4 years, I had told her parents and my parents, we wouldn't get married until I had good health insurance and a job that could could support us.
Oh.
So once we got to that position, we got married. We moved off. Life was very Norman Rockwell, I would say.
You guys went through so much before you even got married.
The interesting thing is there's a lot that I haven't brought up yet, because we did go through a lot. My wife was dealing with a lot of physical problems, which I kind of touched on earlier, that she was being homeschooled,
Right.
or whatever they called it through the school district.
The homebound.
Homebound, yes, thank you. That she was having lots and lots of very serious health problems, and looking back now on those things, I see them in a very different light than I do now. But she had debilitating headaches all of the time, and had gone to specialist after specialist. They initially had diagnosed her with, they said she had chronic fatigue syndrome. Then they said she had systemic lupus. And then, as we went further down the line, this continued on after we had graduated from college, after we had gotten married. She was still having these terrible headaches. So we started seeing neurosurgeons, and for quite some time, and by quite some time I mean 2 years, almost every Friday we were going to the ER, and she was having a spinal tap
Wow.
to release fluid and pressure in her head, and that's how bad they were. And this coming from someone who I had a terrible fear of needles, being to the point where doctors actually had me assisting with the spinal taps, holding things at one point. So she was going through all of these physical issues, and that she had pseudotumor cerebri, which is essentially looks like a tumor in your brain, but it's not. The long story short of it is they started putting in all of these different shunts to control the pressure within her head.
Wow.
And quite literally, she had over 100 different surgeries for revisions, replacing and changing these shunts out over a 3-4 year period.
That's wild. I have a son with a shunt, and we've only had to replace it twice, and he's 10.
Wow, that there was a point where almost an infamous. I mean, my wife and I laugh about it now, but we had been at a Blockbuster Video, just to date this story, on a Friday. Had gotten Chinese food, and I looked down, and her shirt was wet, where the shunt had ruptured and was actually leaking out through an incision. When 3 weeks later, after she had another revision, literally the exact same thing occurred as we had gone and gotten Chinese food, had gone to Blockbuster Video. I looked down at her shirt, and she looked at me, and it was one of those moments of, don't know. I would say euphoria is a feeling but that's a positive thing. This was like a joining of our minds in this is a terrible, terrible thing, but all we can do is stand here and cry and laugh in Blockbuster Video because it's happened again.
Right.
So,
Wow.
she was going through all of these things, and looking at it now, I can't blame the doctors in any way, shape, or form. They have specific trainings, and I don't know if it's a kind of hubris, but people look at things and everybody wants to be able to fix things and tends to see things within whatever lane they drive in.
Right.
So, you have a broken garbage disposal. You call the electrician, and he's going to want to replace the motor on the garbage disposal. You call the plumber, and he starts working on unclogging the pipes. And that's what I really feel was happening with us, is we were seeing these different specialists. Everyone was coming up with a diagnosis, telling us how they could fix it, and we were going through all the ropes of having them fix it, but none of them really were seeing the real problem. And we weren't going to see the problem for another, 14, 15 years. And I only, looking back on it now, can kind of understand it.
Wow.
So we were going through all of these things with her physically, to the point where they actually did what they called a cerebral decompression, where they removed pieces of her skull at one point. They, did the cerebral decompression. I mean, some pretty heavy duty surgeries.
That's serious.
So, yes. So all of this was going on over a course of, call it 7 years. And we finally had reached, and despite all of that, I would say we had from our side, our point of view, a very, great life.
That makes sense too, why you would want to make sure you had health insurance before you got married.
Yes, exactly. Things moved on, and after the cerebral decompression, my wife started feeling better. She would still have these headaches, but they weren't as intense as they had been before. And we kind of moved into a new stage of our lives, where we had our first daughter, then we had our second, then we had our son. My wife was an elementary school teacher, and when our kids came along, decided that she wanted to homeschool.
Oh,
So
we did that too. It's very intense.
Yes, very, very intense. But she put herself into that just as much as she had with her studies and with everything else. And she did that for almost 13 years.
Wow.
And putting her all into it. And I would always say she was holding herself to higher standards than anyone else ever would. And looking back on it, I see a lot of other reasons why. I can see that part of this was a cocooning for protection for herself and for the kids also.
Right.
So then, about 3 years ago, one of my wife's abusers passed away, and at the same time, my oldest daughter was reaching puberty, and I know my wife was putting a lot of additional pressures on herself with the homeschooling, and for lack of a better word, she had a breakdown or maybe a breakthrough.
I love that. I really, really love how you said that. And as I shared with you before, that's very similar to what happened with us. That we were homeschooling, and that was such an intense experience. It was in part to protect our children and in part to protect ourselves. And our parents died, and all these other things where we just fell apart.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ultimately what got us help, but a very parallel way, that's exactly what happened to us.
It's interesting, I don't know a lot of people with DIDs, but from my chats with people on the boards and things like that, it's amazing to me how looking back how many parallels I find in our story and others.
Yes.
You know, from the the physical problems that she had to the hyper focus, excelling.
Right.
It's very, very interesting to I see things clearer now than I did as I was living through them.
Right. You know so much now about what was going on then that you didn't know at that time.
Right, exactly. So as this happened, I very quickly realized that there was more going on, and almost instantly I knew that this was relating back to her childhood and the abuse from her childhood.
Come from breakdown, the hospital, where did you figure that out?
I actually connected that when she had the breakdown, because quite frankly, the reaction that she had, she barricaded herself into a corner and was pulling furniture and things over top of herself. And it was one of those instances of, okay, she's trying to protect herself from something, and it's not something that she's dealing with in the now.
In that moment, you could just see.
Yes, and actually, my first reaction, surprisingly, wasn't to call, an ambulance or to call the doctors. I called her sister, who had gone through, the childhood also,
right.
And I said, this is what I think is happening, and she's actually in the medical field. She drove out to our house, and she was like, we need to get her in. She's not in a safe place right now mentally.
Right.
Now, what I didn't know, because one of the, I would almost say, one of the defining parts of DIDS is secrecy. Now, be that internal secrecy or ends up becoming an external secrecy now because of the stigma and things that we are trying to change. But her sister actually has DIDS and had been diagnosed with DIDS some time ago.
Oh, wow.
I never knew that, which surprised me, because we are a very close family.
So at this point in the story, when she's coming over to check on your wife, she had already been diagnosed herself?
Yes, she had.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, she had. And quite frankly, it's one of those things too, where looking back on it, there was things and things that she did and behaved that now I see very differently than I would have then. It's been quite an eye opener. So we took my wife in, and as I'm sure many of your listeners have dealt with, the mental health facilities can be some pretty bad places at times.
They're so brutal, and we need them in emergencies, but trauma specific, or they don't know what they're seeing, then they don't get it, and it's really, really causing problems. It's very traumatizing.
That's the ER definitely wasn't the place. I understand that they didn't have the tools to see this or know what they were dealing with. I mean, quite honestly, my wife didn't know, and she'd been dealing with it for years upon years upon years.
Right.
But the just general mental health, what guidance wasn't there. So she ended up in a place that was not really good for her. It was not a setting that would make her feel safe in any form or fashion. It was mainly a place that worked with people with addictions issues. So there was a lot of yelling and a lot of angry people, and a lot of doctors who seemed like they were at the end of their ropes from dealing with yelling and angry people.
How terrifying!
And it was a terrifying place for her. Honestly, it was a terrifying place for me because it was not where I would want my wife to be.
Right.
I had a terrible time getting any information or any guidance from these doctors, and quite frankly, some of them said things and came across dealing just very, very rough. I mean, one of her doctors described her condition as deja vu, which I was like, that is not a medical condition. What are you talking about? And he said, well, she's very dramatic here. I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, I can see that there's some dissociation going on with her, but there's a lot of drama in her, which to me either equates to how I read that was, I don't believe what's going on with your wife. She's just, making a big scene.
Right.
That was what I don't know if that's what he meant, but in the brief 5 minutes, and literally that was about the amount of time that I got with him, was 5 minutes. And the one nugget that he threw out there was, I know that there's dissociation going on.
Right. Even though the rest of it was so infuriating and disrespectful, at least you had that word, like a piece to the puzzle.
Exactly. And
but he didn't explain that or elaborate at all.
No, he didn't. And I was able to talk with some of the people that were working there on the floor, and they were telling me, hey, we're watching over her, and I was like, well, what's going on? And they were like, well, she's okay, but she's sitting a lot by herself, and she will only sleep with her bed on the floor against the wall, and just a lot of, they were giving me little tidbits of information. But I very quickly at that point was like, okay, I've got to find a way to get her out of here and get her to some place that is more apt, more able to help her along. So, I did work with some other providers in the area, and as I mentioned, my sister-in-law is in the medical field, and she helped steer me in the right direction.
Oh, wow.
And I was able to get her transferred to some place that was much better suited. And
that's amazing. That's really hard to do.
It was. And it was one of those periods where they kept saying, well, if she makes it through these next 2 days, then we'll send her home. And I was like, wait, I don't think home is the right place for her right now, as much as that pains me to say.
Right.
Home isn't where she needs to be, but I sure as heck know she's not supposed to be here.
Good for you.
And I finally went in with the paperwork saying, listen, she is coming out. She is under my supervision. I am taking her elsewhere because she cannot stay in this place any longer. And I've got it set up that she's going someplace else.
You're everyone's hero right now. Busting her out of there.
It was just, it was a hard situation, and this was just making it worse. So we were able to get her to move to someplace else, and they worked with her, and she was stabilized. And I had some doctors there who were very helpful. And at that point, no one was saying DIDS, but they were saying, asking, well, did she come from an abusive background, or what do you know? They were giving me little breadcrumbs along the way about what was happening.
Oh, interesting.
And it wasn't until she got out and was released and was able to come home, and that was a whole another level of trauma, because it was, she didn't feel ready to.
Right. Right.
But very quickly, when she came home, I mean, the very first night, I remember her walking out of our bedroom and just staring at our front door, and then walking back to me, and she just broke down crying. And I was like, "Sweetie, what's wrong?" And she said, I don't remember putting the shirt on. I was like, "Okay." She said, "I went in to put on some clothes, and I've got to take this off." And it was a strange reaction to me, because I mean, it was just like, a comfy t-shirt and jammies,
Right.
but it was so foreign to her at that point.
She was really
because
distressed.
yes, I remember her going in and changing into something else. And at that point, we started looking for some longer term therapy. She was going into a day hospital, a partial day,
Right.
to kind of help work with things. And there were a few instances there where they called me one day because she was under a table and wouldn't come out. And another time where she was hiding in the bathroom. And it was strange because 80% of the time she was just the normal woman I always knew, and then it was like a switch had been turned, and yes, and suddenly she didn't know what was going on. I mean, she was very concerned that she was just crazy, and that's what she said over and over again. I don't want to go home. I think I'm crazy. I don't know what's happening. Very, very just torn apart and confused. And that little kernel that had been dropped earlier, with the word dissociation, and the things that some of the doctors had mentioned along the way, and what was happening with her, under a table or wandering around the house. And I didn't mention that before, but that was something also. She had always been prone to sleepwalking, and had never, that had happened for the years upon years. I used to always tell her, you're doing strange things at night. She'd be like, "What do you mean strange things at night?" I'd say, "Sweetie, I would look over, and your arms were up, and it looked like you were writing, or looked like you were drawing in the air." And she always just thought I was making it up. So there was a lot of history that I had to draw upon, that when I had that word dissociation and I started looking into it, I thought, there's something more here. These pieces are falling into line with this dissociative identity disorder. And then, while she was in the hospital, I came across a stack of papers over under her journal that it wasn't her writing, but it was there in her journal. And then I found a couple different names in that. And then, strangely enough, while she was in the day hospital, one of the things that they have them do there is journal and do these workbooks. And flipping through that one day, lo and behold, I found the same writing and the same name, and it was like, bingo, this is what's going on. This is what's going on. So at that point, I was able to start having a more intelligent discussion with the doctors and the therapists, and say, "Hey, have you guys looked at this? Is this what's going on?" And they were pretty much in agreement at that point. They started saying, this fits. This fits with what you're dealing with. Now, me figuring it out and then her figuring it out is like two separate worlds apart.
Right. You had a diagnosis at least, or she did, and you knew about it at that point.
Right. And me knowing about it and the doctor saying it didn't mean that she believed it in any form or fashion.
Right. That seems to be pretty consistent too, that it's really difficult for some of us to accept that that's what's going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, in full honesty, even as I was learning it, I was like, okay, this isn't real. This can't be right, because it was such a foreign concept. And then as you start looking at it and researching it and go, wow, this, even though I had the facts and the pieces and things lined up for me, it was still something that took, I wouldn't say a leap of faith, but it definitely took some time for me to fully absorb, to realize and understand and say, yes. There was a lot of things along the way, people that I talked with that were, counselors and things who had worked with people with DIDs, and most of them, had, a couple of them had worked with a few people with DIDs, and then one who I met online who specialized in working with DIDs, and he kept giving me things, little bits of information, and then I would see those things happening, and I mean, it was strange because he would say something to me, and then it was almost precognitive. It wasn't, but within 2 or 3 days, it would be like, oh, wait a minute, that's just like what he was talking about. I can fully see this now. So,
like putting on glasses, and it was there all the time.
Yes, very, very much so. So that as that picture became clear for me, then it was really the process of, okay, how can I make this clear for her, and how can we figure out how to normalize this for everybody in her, because I don't want anyone to wake up and be confused and not know where they are and wandering around the house. I don't want someone to be scared because they don't know what shirt they're wearing.
That's really huge. That's a hard place. In the very early days of getting diagnosed and trying to sort of spread the word, so to speak, about what's going on and orienting everybody and getting everyone on the same page and rescuing some of those that are more internal or less present in the now time, like in the present day. It's a real challenge doing what you're talking about to make them feel safe and oriented and know where they are and what's going on.
Yes, that was, and I thought the challenges with my wife were difficult, and then I met my first part, which I don't necessarily know if that's the word that everybody likes. I headmate or family member.
Right, another insider.
Well, insider who became an outsider.
Right, exactly. There's so much language, and everyone has different preferences.
Yes, and that's a challenge because some people get very entrenched in which words they want to use.
You'll see on the online groups and the forums, you'll see someone will say, I found out I have DID and that I've got these parts, and they're like, and you're also a part, sweetie.
Right.
Oh.
So that was that was the language. Actually, I think is one of those challenging things that we as a DIDS community, I guess we would say, need to be very kind and very soft with each other, because it is such a journey, and people are at different spots along the journey and how they are working together.
Yes. There's room
so
for passion there. There's room for
Yes.
compassion.
Yes, and that's funny you say compassion, because that was one of the first challenges, or I would actually say breakthroughs that I had. So I met the first person that came out, and she was very young, and there's horses that our neighbors have, and I had been driving with my wife. She was just staring off at these horses and listening to the music on the radio very loud. And we talked for a little bit, and I realized, okay, this is somebody else now. And it was a very, very good experience. And later on, I learned that she was kind of sent out to be the guinea pig, if you will, because she's someone who normally doesn't talk. And others were putting her out to see if it was a safe time to be out.
Testing
And
the
then,
waters.
yes, testing the waters. And then very shortly thereafter, I met someone who, again, using the words of Dids, would be a protector, or I guess you could also say the gatekeeper.
Mm-hmm.
She was the one who said that she knew the way in and out, and could let people in and out.
Oh wow!
And initially was a very hard person to work with. I mean, was very much stuck in the past, and I think and that's understandable. In the language of Dids, you would say that my wife had pretty much fronted or driven for almost 30 years. There were instances where others had probably popped in and out, but she was driving the bus. She had been driving the bus for a long time, and there were a lot of others who were very much living in the past and past trauma, and coming from coming out of those experiences. And one of the things I always say when people are talking about headmates or altars or whatever you want to say, and are talking about, I'm always seeing posts where on a lot of the supporters boards people are saying, I'm having a hard time dealing with this particular element, this particular person.
Right.
And I always pull it back to the analogy of a soldier at war. When a soldier comes back, oftentimes they've seen terrible things. They've been involved with terrible things, and there's that PTSD. There's that shell shock,
Right.
and they have been shaped by those experiences. And I know that, and I understand that. I 150% with all of my being can appreciate everything that soldier has done and be grateful for what they've done, and I will give them the love and the honor for the battles that they have fought.
Right.
And I will give them compassion and space to try to normalize now that they're not in those battles.
Oh, you made me cry. That's really powerful. I appreciate you sharing that.
I think it's one of those. I think it's powerful because I think it's true, and I think it's something that is an easy way for everyone to understand. By the same time, I also say, and with that, you still need to hold that soldier. You need to hold that person. You still need to hold that part responsible for their actions. This is not about absolving someone for responsibility for what they do, but this is about giving people space and compassion to live and to heal. When initially, this one part came out and was it was just not cooperating, not no, I wouldn't even say cooperating, but just wasn't being very nice.
Right.
You know,
Sure.
I had the discussion of why did you do what you did? The reply was, well, she, my wife, was little, and I couldn't let that happen. And I said, okay, well, you have just gone on and on about how, you know, terrible this world is, and how that gives you the right to be terrible to everyone else. But you have just shown me an example of pure love. And that is the kind of person, I'm going to cry now. That is the kind of person that I want to be. That is the example.
I'm so blown right now.
that is the kind of person that I want to be. And that is how I try to live my life. So when you're saying that the world is this dark and evil and terrible place, I understand it, because I know that that's what you've come through. But you have already shown me by your example that that is not the way this world is, because that is not what you were operating out of.
Oh my goodness. You just completely turned the world upside down. Like, I don't even know how to process what you just said. I have no intelligent response because so many things are happening in my head right now.
That realization, that discussion was turning point for me and for my wife, and for her understanding of DIDS, and for how we were going to live and be with this. You know, because there's so much confusion within a person with DIDS. There is that denial within oneself of this I really don't have this can't be happening, you know, these voices are just, this is me being crazy. There is the guilt that comes from a mom who has you know, been homeschooling, who suddenly can't. There is so much going on, and we had to reground ourselves of, okay, this is who we are, this is what we are going through. Let's understand it. Let's treat ourselves. You treat everyone in there the way that you have lived and want to treat others, and this will help us manage through this. This will help us understand. And it has it is, you know, it is not a it's not always an easy process. You know, there's always been challenges along the way, because I like to talk about the reality of now. And I know this isn't the reality that everyone has, but I always talk about, you know what, the reality of now is that you are safe. Everybody is safe. You are loved. You know, everybody is loved. And you are secure. And you are secure, you know, that's not because of me, but that is because of where you are in time and space. You know, that is where all of you have gotten yourself to. You know, it has been a team play this whole time. This has all been a group effort to get to where you are. And let's acknowledge, you know, the spot where we're at, and let's also, you know, see how we can continue to work together, to grow, you know, to live, to be happy. Let's acknowledge, yes, terrible things happened in the past, and let's make sure that no one's living in the past, though.
Okay.
Let's make sure that no one's holding on to.
You have again just blown my mind. That's so empowering, and it's so powerful. The listeners of the podcast know that one of the things our therapist has taught us is that now time is safe. And I could add to that one thing our husband says a lot, that the husband says a lot to everybody, is you are safe, you are loved. Like, now time is safe, like trying to practice that. And so it's been this mantra for almost a year on this podcast. Now time is safe, now time is safe. As if we say it enough times, we'll believe it. But you just took that and put it into perspective as a gift we had already given ourselves. Like that, this was the whole point.
Yes.
Like, we've made it.
Yes.
Well, I'm
yes,
pretty
exactly.
sure I'm healed. I don't know about you guys, but I'm all better.
It's funny because on a very practical level, one of the things that I did when my wife came back from the hospital is my children and I covered the wall of our bedroom, floor to ceiling, in pictures, framed pictures, because I thought, what a great way to actually have and acknowledge, not just where we are, but also where we've been, so that no matter who is waking up, because very often it's somebody else, they can turn and look and see. And we have positive pictures from their childhood. We have pictures of our journey along the way.
This is crazy because we did that too. That's another parallel we have. Our bedroom wall we covered in photographs and put even like, these are the names of the kids and these are the...
Yes.
Oh,
there's that's funny you said it, because there's post-it notes on picture, little arrows of...
I feel so less crazy now. I'm so glad that I talked to you.
You know what? It was funny. Just on a funny kind of practical note, there was a phase, there was a time where, and I've heard this from many people, where mirrors were a terrible, terrible issue for my wife.
Right.
She and I 1,000% can understand that. Suddenly looking in the mirror and going, wait a minute, that's not me. Who is that? And having anyone, someone who hasn't driven, I use the term driven instead of front very often. Someone who hasn't driven in a long time, suddenly looking at it going, wait a minute, that looks like an adult. That looks scary, So there was a real challenge with mirrors.
Right.
So, after finding my wife a number of times glass-eyed in front of it, or, recoiled in fear because of it, I was like, why don't we just get rid of the mirrors for a while?
That's amazing.
And she looked at me and she was like, you would do that? I was like, sure, if that's what it takes to help, sure. So we took down the mirrors for a while.
That's amazing.
And it was one of those things like, here, let's start. If we need, look, here's a compact and it has a mirror. It's sitting folded up over here if somebody needs it. And also, it's a great way to reacclimate. They got to a point where she was, okay, I want to get used to mirrors, which I know people outside the community would be listening to this and thinking, what's he talking about? But it's something that needs to happen. So she would look at the little mirror. And it was something small that she could control. So there's a lot of like little practical...
That's brilliant.
Things.
That's an exposure kind of therapy.
Yes. That she so, anyways, it got to a point where my wife was feeling much more comfortable, and we had that discussion and that breakthrough, and honestly, that made it much easier. Now there was challenges along the way, but one of the things that I knew was just really tearing at my wife was, how do I talk about this with the kids? What's the discussion there? Because this has been a nuclear bomb in their lives.
You mean your outside kids?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Just clarifying.
Correct. I'm glad you did. What can we do to have this? What can we do with this? What kind of discussion can we have? And I I I am very much open and honest kind of person. I think that especially with DIDs, I think that's really important.
Right.
Because it again, there's so much of this is just about hiding of memories, hiding of the past, and then even now it's there's still so much of a hiding because of what's portrayed out in the culture. I didn't want to keep this from the kids, but at the same time, I know that this is hard for adults to understand. This is hard for medical personnel to understand, and there has been so much uh, negativity over the years in dealing with this, and talking about multiple personality disorder or DIDs. I knew I wanted to be able to talk with my kids, so I started looking around, trying to find some resources.
Yeah.
And I found a few books that were a little bit older, written, late 80s ish. I bought them off of Amazon. And quite frankly, I found them a little scary. Now that's not to say they weren't dealing with truth, because, there's it's scary and confusing. Lord knows it's scary and confusing for someone with DIDs, and it can be, just as much for all of us on the outside. That's understandable. But the resources that I was finding were really reflecting too much that scary side, and I was like, this is not how I want to be able to talk about it. Every book I picked up had some scary black and white picture of someone staring into a mirror with someone else staring back, and while I had gone through that and I acknowledged that is a reality, that wasn't the reality and how I wanted to talk about it with a kid.
Right.
Because I didn't want to feed into kind of the culture of
Holy
fear.
fuck.
Looking
Holy
for something
fuck.
that
Holy
is
fuck.
accurate, but
Hang on.
also focused on the healing and what you said.
Yo, I can't believe it. Do I hear your little footsteps once more? Hell yeah, you do. Yep, it's me again. I gotta be honest with you. Got got it up to here with this dang tower. Patience, little voice, patience. With each step you... And if I hear the gestures laugh one more time, I swear. Perhaps the lift of another hex will lift your spirits. It'll help. As... Oh, I hated those damn shapes from floor 20. Blaze it. Oh yeah, so, gain brief invincibility while dashing. Commit upwards trajectory while dashing. Um, I think this is probably gonna be more useful. The other thing could save your ass, but it could also make me more risky. And I'm already like that too much. Wait, so I'm trying to... Oh, wait. Did I just exit it without getting it? Or, no wait, I already... So it's LB. I did finally figure out how to, use my, like, settings to update the controller, but I thought it was RB, not LB that you use for the power, and I did not set LB because I'm using a GameCube controller. So I guess I'll go back to Xbox 360. Because I think you have to, like, close out the game to be able to change the controls. Protective Fairy Hex. Gain a persistent fairy that respawns after a long delay. So it's like an extra hit, and then 2 hits before leaving. I think this is probably the better one. I don't know how long the delay is, though. I wish they were more specific on that. but I think I'd rather have it respawn. But yo, that's only floor 25. I thought it was going to be every 10 floors from now on. But I guess it goes back and forth. Like, it was 10 from 10 to 20. Now it's 5 from 20 to 25. Um, and then it's going to be 10, and then it's going to be 5. So we have hookshot hex, and then checkpoint hex. So that's interesting. So I was assuming all my powers would come back, but I guess we're not doing the wheel and we're not doing time stop, which is interesting because I saw roads that were kind of like specific to the wheel power, and I saw like time stop areas, but that's fair. Honestly, I feel like I love the wheel ability, but I feel like it's not very useful here because it's like too risky to because you're not in control as much when you're using it. And then I just don't like time stop. And then yeah, I'm excited to see hookshot. I'm really excited about this. Oh, that sounds so useful. I have like so much more faith. So gain a flexible, replaceable, yo, but it breaks after one revive. So you only get to use it once. But that combined with the fairy, damn, I feel like I could beat this. Also, because I feel like the fairy will help that much, I might just upload these attempts straight without editing because I'm lazy, and also I think there won't be as many videos as I'm thinking. I don't know. We'll see. Who knows what I'll do. Um I'm so curious if I can get to floor 25 because it's only 5 more floors without dying. I don't know. Let me try unplugging the GameCube controller and turning on the Xbox 360 controller and seeing if that will work. Okay, it does. Yeah, well, did not need to go back there. Okay, let's resume the podcast. I just had to. Oh wait, who's in the pool this time? Oh yo, it's you. I was hoping it'd be DK, but it's funny that there's always a character in the pool. Hey, hey, hey! Where the heck am I? What kind of hard to explain. I doubt it. Try me. I'm very clever, you know. You're in a portal made by a weird hand in a wall. Well, who is helping me get rid of a hex placed on me by a jester dude who has a tower that's impossibly tall. That makes no sense. Are you feeling okay? Never mind. So yeah, I'm very curious. How hard? I'm almost curious if I can update those controls though, because I just feel so much more comfortable with the GameCube controller than the Xbox 360 controller. Mainly because the Xbox 360 controller, the one I have, the like the tips of the analog sticks, um, like decayed, and we had to replace them with like cute little paw print ones that look really cute, but they're kind of they're meant to go on a non-decayed stick, so they're a little loose. But let me see if I can. I might be able to do this. Yeah, maybe I can. I thought I had to close out the game for it to update or whatever. Let's try it. Okay, left shoulder. Maybe if I make left shoulder the right shoulder button then. And then I'll make right shoulder the right D-pad button. I hate how the mouse pointer is so off though. I don't know if that's an issue for everyone. When you go into the settings to I can't press it because it's like it's too off. I don't know how to explain it. Okay, here we go. Let's see if I actually kept the layout. It did not. It even took the shoulder button away that I had set up. It worked before. It's so confusing and touchy sometimes. Oh wait, did I... Maybe I didn't hit save. Maybe I accidentally hit clear and exit, actually. That's funny. Let's see if it works this time. It went away! Fuck. Okay, let me try one more thing. What if I hit save? And I name it like they keep asking me to. Will that work? It's still gone. What if I close it and bring it up again? Why is it doing this? It pisses me off. How did we get it to work a second ago? And the mouse being off. Okay. What if I close it here? And then I'll reopen it to see if... Nope. Maybe it won't work if I have a game open. I don't know why that would mess with it, but it's touchy. Like, if I go back in the game... Oh, okay, it worked, but it said it was... It kept showing that it didn't keep my configurations, but whatever. Wait, I just now realized the glide works completely different. Normally you glide forever and ever until you let go, but it's just a boost of speed. But it might be good that it works this way for the purpose of beating the tower. I don't know. Anyway, back to podcast for real. Let's see if we can get to floor 25 on first try. Probably not, but who knows.
Said earlier about normalizing, like, this is where we're at and what we're going to deal with, not
Yes.
just the fear and the terror of the past. Like, that's the whole point of getting better, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
even as a family.
Exactly. This is.
Oh no.
This is all about survival, which is positive. This is about healing and about a way forward, and I wanted to be able to talk about that with my kids. So I looked around and I couldn't find any great resources. You know what? I will say, Jade Miller's books, I don't know if you've looked at any of those, were some that I found, which they are very good to talk to insiders, but I was looking something really to talk to outsiders.
Right.
So I started thinking about, well, how do I want to have this conversation with my kids? And
okay, you can
because obviously
glide out of a super jump. Should have figured.
They know mommy's been in the hospital. I mean, she's had 2 or 3 different stints at the hospital. They know that things have changed. We need to be able to talk about this. And I had I don't know, another aha kind of moment or an awakening moment when the first time I sat down and talked with my my oldest daughter, and talking to her, and she said, "Oh, wait a minute, multiple personality disorder. I remember seeing this. This is like that thing that I saw in Maury Povich."
Oh my goodness.
And I had to kind of grip teeth. Now, I have not gone back to see what was on or what was presented, but I know from seeing the Maury Povich show before that it was not be the kind of serious discussion or coming from the kind of place that I wanted to have the discussion coming from.
Right.
So I thought this I need to do something. I need to
You need a different
help.
metaphor.
Yes, I need a different forum. I need a different kind of narrative. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to write a kid's book.
Good for you.
So my youngest just turned 6, and my oldest turns 15 tomorrow, which I cannot believe.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, it's being able. She's going to be able to start driver's training soon, and it just blows my mind.
Wow.
It just blows my mind.
No.
The story, or the genesis of the patchwork quilt also ties back into my wife and her story and her healing, because I mean, really, this is all really her story, and I mean that both in a figurative and in very many ways a literal sense, because the story actually, sounds strange, but the story actually happened. One of the traumas that my wife went through when she was younger, and it was strange, because as we were teenagers, I remembered hearing about this in passing, that when my wife was younger, one of her abusers took her blanket, her safety blanket, as many kids would have. I mean, my kids have, and most kids either have a safety blanket or some kind of special animal or something.
Right.
But the abuser took that blanket and cut it up.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It was strange, because I had heard that when we were younger, and when we had first started dating, someone had mentioned that, almost kind of as in passing, oh yeah, he did that, he was a jerk. That was kind of how it was presented out. Well, someone on the inside, and actually a lot of people on the inside, that was a amazingly traumatic experience, and came out to me looking for their blanket, and upset because the blanket had been cut up. What I didn't know at that point was that it was deeply tied to trauma, because it was they had cut the blanket up and then relayed back to my wife, or an insider back then, that was what they could do to anyone.
Right.
Anyone who talked, anyone who told.
Right.
So it was this compounding of this trauma around what should be a great and a beautiful piece of childhood. I mean, like I said, my kids have their security blankets and their wubbies and stuffed animals and things like that, and it just so happens that I still have my blanket from when I was a child, and it was in a hope chest. So the next time that part came out, I gave them my blanket, the quilt that I had as a child, and it was another one of those healing moments, where it just took something that had been so traumatic and was making it right again. And I thought, you know what? This story as a whole could be a great way for me to be able to talk to my kids. So I sat down and I started writing this story, and I did my first rough draft version, where I grabbed clip art and some ideas from online and typed up the text, and I gave that version to my wife, and she sat and she read it, and she cried and she cried and she cried and said, this is beautiful, I love this. And I said, really? And she said yes, you need to do something with this. I said, okay. So I reached out to my niece, who is in college and an illustrator. That's Megan Starling.
Amazing.
and she is a fabulous artist. And being that she is in college, was always always in need of money for books, etc. And she and I spent about a year going back and forth, working through the artwork and the story of the book. I've put it out on a couple of the supporters of DID sites early on, just to get their take, to see, does this something that you guys think is needed? Is this helpful to you? Any input or thoughts on it? And I really had an overwhelmingly positive response. I mean, people were coming back and saying, yes, this is good. I didn't know how to have this conversation with my kids, or you know what, I've actually sat down with the PDF that you sent across, Jeff, and have looked at it with my kids. This has been a great way to talk.
That's amazing.
And it's funny and light, but it's also serious. And I got great feedback that way. And I actually, as I was doing it, my I wouldn't say, I guess I would say my understanding or my sensitivity around DIDs has evolved. So I made some changes in the book to help what I think the storyline to be a little more inclusive. So there's a line in it that says toward the end that says, "I'm gathering up all of the parts," which originally, when I had written it, said, "I'm gathering up all of my parts." But then, as I thought about that, and my understanding has grown, where I was like, this, if I put "my" there, that is a sense of ownership that I don't know. I don't think that's right. It's
good for you.
So I've made some changes along the way, so that it can be very inclusive, for however people want to read and interpret the book. Because as we were talking before, people get very sensitive around words and terms, and I get that and I understand that, and I don't want someone to get lost in getting stuck on something in the book. I want them to be able to use it as a starting point to talk with their family. To I've also had a number of people say, you know what, I don't have kids, but my internal kids love this.
That's amazing. What a gift. Thank you.
I am just hopeful that it finds an audience. I'll say this: I've had a particular moment this past week when my father came up to me and said, I read your book. You and Megan did a great job with that, and it really helped me understand. You should be very proud. And as a son, I was like, yes, but even more so as an author, which I feel haughty saying that, but okay, as a storyteller, I felt very proud because it did what I wanted it to do.
That's amazing.
So, the next steps, I'm working on trying to get an audio version and a little video version done that I can put out there. So, whether someone finds the book or finds the video, however they find it, if it's helpful, then I've done my job. Like I said, I was able to use it to really talk with my kids, and my son was sitting with a copy on the floor reading. So he's, as I said, he's just turned 6. So it's a great way to normalize, and that's what needs to happen. The discussion needs to not be around is this person, is this real, is this fake, is this is this the way it's portrayed in TV? You know, is this like the movies? You know, and that was the other thing that kept bubbling up with me is all the things going on, you know, in the Hollywood portrayals. And, you know, I don't want that. I don't want the Maury Povich to be the baseline for the discussion.
Right.
You know, at least not with my kids.
That's amazing. It's really impressive and it's beautifully done. Beautifully done.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I love it, and I so appreciate you telling us about it, and I will put a link and more information about it up on the blog. But also, I appreciate you just sharing your love story. It is beautiful, and the experience of finding ways to show support and love through the whole process of discovering dissociative identity disorder, as well as just loving her as a whole, is just a beautiful, beautiful example. And you also dropped some pretty heavy pearls of wisdom that we're going to have to process for a while. So thank you for that as well.
Good. I very much enjoyed the discussion, and thank you so much for reaching out and having me on.
I'm so grateful.
Thank you for joining us with System Speak, a podcast about dissociative identity disorder. You can listen to the podcast on Spotify, Google Play, and iTunes, or follow along on our website, www.systemspeak.org. Thanks for listening.
Okay. Oh, I think we already listened to the next one. I'm kind of skipping around a little bit because Snuggle skipped around a little bit on stream before. Yeah, I think I'm on this one.
Hello, this is Dr. E, and I have an interview to share with you today. But before I share the actual interview, you have to listen to this excerpt from the conversation I had with our guest before the interview. It was very powerful for me and something I need to talk about with the therapist, but I want to share it here first. Listen.
Hello.
Yeah,
The audience really is a lot of therapists, also trauma clients, both, specifically dissociative clients and people working with dissociative disorders.
okay. And then what region of the country do you get most of your listeners from?
It's actually pretty global. It started out just as a small kind of learning process thing and really took off, like word spread, which was completely unexpected for me. So that's my own issue, having to process. But there's people from, a lot of people from Canada and the United States, but then also we have regular listeners like from Nepal and Japan and Argentina and Brazil, the Netherlands and Sweden. Like, it's gone crazy. I first heard you speak on another podcast, and I only heard a snippet because with someone else and we were driving, but you were sharing in your background that originally, or in the beginning at some point, you had worked with kids with autism. And I have a son who's autistic, and so I was like, what? So I went back and I found all this other stuff, and it was like a treasure trove. So thank you for your work.
Okay, nice. Okay, so I'm just reading here that you're a DID survivor. So, so
Yeah.
you really understand dissociation in a very intimate way, which is great, actually.
So, did you hear what happened? We started out talking about things about the audience and the podcast, which is very common when you're preparing for an interview. But then she had found the podcast and noted that I was a survivor, which none of the other people I've interviewed have done. It really shook me up because I was surprised, not that it's a secret, but that's the first time it has ever been presented back to me professionally, mirrored to me professionally. Even though this is not an office setting, I don't even know how to respond, even now, and it's been several days. But there are two things I want you to notice. One, I just need to be vulnerable and share about what a big moment this was for me. It was really my first experience ever, even though it's just on my own podcast in this setting, sort of being out and direct about my own diagnosis. Immediately, it left me in a very vulnerable state. It is a true statement, and it is something that is real, and it is something that I've worked a long time to grapple with. And learning about it, and educating about it, and fighting stigma about it is part of the whole reason of this podcast. This was not a third hand, outside of myself, focusing on someone else or listening to other parts kind of experience. This was me, specifically Dr. E, having a conversation about my own DID experience. I mean, it was just a split second, but it was a powerful moment and significant. Like, I will never forget this moment. But the second thing I want to point out, especially since recently we've been talking about attachment and shame theories and different perspectives on trauma and fighting stigma and healing. Because look what she did and how well she handled that in such a compassionate way. She did not at all shame me about it. What she said was that I was a survivor, that I understood dissociation in an intimate way. And she even used the word good. I have to tell you, that moment, which wasn't even a full second long, I can literally see it on the timeline. That moment that was not even a second long was like the opposite of shame. It was bigger than healing. It was an entire paradigm shift within myself that I could physically feel when it happened. I don't even have better words to describe it than that. But it was so significant, I needed to include it on this podcast, both so that I would hear it again, so that others would listen, and also so I could talk about it with my therapist. Here's the next piece of what happened when I had to respond to her. I stumbled a little bit, but I really wanted to own that part of myself and recognize the vulnerability and stay present with it instead of escaping it. And it was really hard for me, actually, and I was very shaky, but I did it, and I responded, and she stayed right there in that moment, and it helped me stay there in that moment.
This part is
and
awkward.
it was just
I don't
a powerful
get it fully.
experience. So listen to what happened next.
So I can share more about that. I am a survivor. I have my PhD, and I was licensed in private practice for 20 years.
I think I'm gonna stop for now to eat and do other things. Might come back to this tomorrow. But hey, I'm happy I got the next hex removed. I might need to watch a video or something of someone beating the 21st floor, because I'm like, I don't even get how to do that first part there. I think I'm not used to the glide being as short as it is now. It's kind of hard to get used to, but anyway. See y'all next time, I guess.